Welcome to Piecemeal, a podcast hosted by the Emily Program. Piecemeal covers topics related to eating disorders, body image, and how society may influence our thinking. Please use your discretion when listening and speak with a therapist as needed. I'm your host, Jillian Lampert. Mallary Tenore Tarpley is here today to share her journey navigating an eating disorder and to talk to us about her amazing new book called Slip. Mallary is a journalism and writing professor at the University of Texas at Austin's Moody College of Communications and McCombs School of Business. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, among many other publications. She graduated from Providence College and has an MFA in nonfiction writing from Goucher College. She lives outside of Austin, Texas, with her husband and 2 children. We're so happy you're here, Mallary.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Well, let's just dive in. I know there's so much to talk about, but let's start with a little background about Slip. When you and I first met when you were writing Slip, and we talked about the work the eating disorders field is doing to share best practices, and we bonded a little bit about our recovery stories. I have so many questions to ask you about your journey, but let's just start with current day. Tell us a little bit about Slip, why you wrote it, and maybe what you want it to be in the world.
Sure. Well, I'm so delighted to be here and really excited to talk about Slip and my journey with you. And Slip is a narrative nonfiction book that really blends my own personal narrative alongside research and reporting that I did. So it follows my own personal narrative of developing anorexia when I was a child after my mother passed away and looks at my treatment for that, as well as my ongoing recovery from the eating disorder. And I felt in many ways that I wanted to tell my story because I am a writer at heart. I always have been a writer. I've always wanted to write a book. But in many ways, I realized that I fit the stereotypical mold of someone with an eating disorder and that I am a woman, I am white, I live in a smaller body, and many other kind of realities. And so I thought, what if I expanded the lens beyond my own narrative and interviewed lots of other people so that I could bring their perspectives into the book? So I ended up surveying over 700 people from 44 states and 37 countries and interviewed 175 people, including survey respondents, but also clinicians like you and researchers. And that really broadened my scope of understanding about eating disorders and enabled me to really wrap my head around some of the latest research. And one of the driving questions behind this book was, what does it mean to be better, but not all better? And what does it mean to live with the imprints of your disorder and to know that it remains a vulnerability? Because for me, for many years, I found myself in this place of not really understanding where I was at in my recovery because I knew I wasn't fully recovered, but I also wasn't acutely sick anymore. And so I came to call this space the middle place, which is essentially this gray space between acute sickness and full recovery. And for a long time, I thought that I was the only one in this space, and because I never heard anyone else talk about it. And then when I began to interview people for the book, I realized that this space is quite populous, and yet it's not talked about very often. And I think part of the reason is because sometimes it's stigmatized. Sometimes we think that slips equal failure. And that is the reason I titled the book Slip, was because I want to destigmatize slips in the recovery process and recognize that slips can be opportunities for growth rather than grounds for failure. And so in many ways, I want this book to give voice to folks in the middle place and also to just serve as a tool for educating more people on what eating disorders are and the many ways in which recovery can take shape.
That is so beautifully described, and having had the honor to read the book, I think you absolutely captured just that. Take us back. Let's sort of dive in on your story a little bit. So, around 12 years old, when your eating disorder started, talk us through a little bit about the beginnings of your eating disorder, what was happening for you then, and how your sort of perspective now of how the eating disorder began.
Yes. So when I was 8, my mom was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer, and she was sick for about 3 years. And my family was very much of the mindset that we needed to be strong and put on a happy face and believe that mom was going to make it. And in some ways, that was a coping mechanism. There was also a bit of toxic positivity going on there, but I really held on to hope that my mom was going to make it. And so when she died at age 40, when I was 11, I really was just completely caught off guard and really did not know what to make of that. And continued to feel like I needed to be strong. So the day after she died, I went to school and didn't tell my teachers what had happened. I read her eulogy without crying. There were points when I actually smiled a little bit. But behind that happy facade, I felt like my world was crumbling and I didn't know how to grapple with that. And as the months passed, I felt farther and farther away from my mother. And so, as an 11, 12-year old, I conjured up this idea that maybe if I stayed the same size my mom was, then I could somehow be closer to her. Or if I could stay the same size that I was when she was alive, I could be closer. And so I then began to restrict my food intake, and food restriction became this warped form of time travel in some ways. And at the same time, I was in a health class where the teacher was telling us about good foods, quote unquote, and bad foods. And I was really learning about, oh, well, this is a type of food you should eat versus this kind that you shouldn't eat. And so that was all coming into play as well and was teaching me about this idea that you could control your body in some way. And I couldn't control what happened to my mom's body, but I could control what I put into mine. And so my mother's death and the suppressed grief and this health class and other factors very much played into the eating disorder. And as a journalist, I was also curious about media influences, and I went back and looked at the media I was consuming at the time. And my father had gotten me a subscription to 17 magazine, and he thought that this magazine might help me to just be able to glean insights into womanly issues that he didn't feel like he could really assist me with as a dad. So I was consuming this teenage magazine, and I went back and I ordered on eBay the first copy of the magazine that I had ever gotten in the mail. And the cover story was titled Girls Who Exercise Themselves to Death. And I reread that story as an adult and was so struck by the fact that it was all about eating disorders and food restriction. And it occurred to me that that was probably my first introduction to eating disorders. So there was just this confluence of factors that came into play that very quickly led me to develop anorexia.
Oh, it gives such illumination to what we know now, and certainly didn't know quite as much back then about all of the sort of multiple factors that contribute to the development of an eating disorder that are so many times described as sort of that perfect storm. And I hear that in your story so much. You had this incredible trauma, this suppressed grief, this social influence. You were at a time when your body was very likely starting to change, and life was extremely stressful, and the social message about, eat this, not that, so prevalent. And that, wow, what an incredible retrospective look at that cover of 17 magazine, and also highlights, as you were saying that, thinking, of course, 17 was really never written for 17-year-olds, was it? You were 12, and you were probably exactly the target audience for that kind of literature at that point, right?
Yes, very much so. I thought that 17 magazine was something that only 17-year-olds could read. So I felt very grown up reading it. And even at the time, there were really harmful ads in the back of the magazine telling young children that they could lose weight. And so there were definitely some influences at play there that I think had some sort of impact on me.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So you did receive some treatment, and had sort of a bit of a convoluted or complicated or winding path to treatment, as many people do. Tell us a little bit about seeking treatment, what that was like for you. Really focused on the things that were really difficult, and also the things that really were helpful.
Yes. So When I was restricting and exercising a lot and in this sort of just really bad moment with my eating disorder, my father was trying to get help for me. And so he had taken me to the pediatrician, and the pediatrician essentially told him that what I was going through was just a passing phase. And my father just tried to take his word for it, but we went home and I continued with these harmful behaviors. And then 6 months later, my father took me back to the pediatrician only to be told the same thing. So our pediatrician certainly did not know what I was struggling with. And to be honest, I didn't have the words to describe what it was I was grappling with. I had read about eating disorders, but I thought that people with eating disorders didn't eat anything at all. And so I thought, well, I'm eating, so I don't have an eating disorder. And my father's only point of reference was Karen Carpenter, a singer songwriter who had died from complications due to anorexia. And that made national headlines at the time. And so my father thought that only adults struggled with eating disorders. And in an effort to seek help for me, he talked with a family friend who was a nurse, and she suspected I was struggling with anorexia and suggested that my father take me to Boston Children's Hospital. So he took me. I was admitted that same day and was in and out of Boston Children's Hospital for several times. I was on the medical unit twice and on the psychiatric ward unit there 3 times. So I was in that revolving door of treatment, as we would say, and was really trying to work through my disorder, but felt like every time I would go home, I would fall back into the same disordered behaviors. And so my treatment team had suggested that I needed a higher level of care and ended up going to residential treatment for 17 months. Now, that length of time is almost unheard of these days. And I should say that I was very fortunate in that my public school system and the Department of Mental Health in Massachusetts, where I lived, they essentially covered the costs of my psychiatric ward stays and also residential treatment. Otherwise, there was no way my family could have afforded that. And so when I was in treatment, there were a couple of things that were difficult. So I'll start with those. I mean, I think in many ways, being institutionalized so many times at a very young age really kind of enabled me to identify with my illness more. And so I distinctly remember being in the hospital and moving from saying I have anorexia to I am anorexic. And it felt like it was becoming more and more of my identity as an adolescent. And it was also the first place where I ever met other people with eating disorders. And so, while in some ways that was helpful, there was also some social contagion just in terms of sharing eating disorder tips. And there was a fair amount of competitiveness that I felt in being alongside these other girls in treatment. So, I think those two factors were particularly difficult. But as I look back at what helped me, there were a lot of really just amazing staffers at Boston Children's Hospital, and they were really intent on helping me to kind of understand the origins of my eating disorder more. And they also, I think, in some ways practiced harm reduction, even though they wouldn't have called it that at the time. But when I was at Boston Children's, I was also diagnosed with severe obsessive compulsive disorder and anxiety and depression. And one of my OCD behaviors was exercising a lot. And as a child, my form of exercise was jumping. I just jumped everywhere that I went. And that was really hard to stop that behavior in the hospital. And so when I initially got there, the staff members allowed me 5 jumps a day, right? Which was much less than what I'd been doing at home. But there was something about those 5 jumps that just really made me feel safe. The fact that they recognized that it was very hard for me to just stop completely, and they were trying to kind of help me to recognize that this was in fact a very harmful behavior, but they understood it would be difficult to just stop altogether. There were various examples of that, but looking back, that was actually helpful for me at the time. And in residential treatment, it was incredibly helpful to be there for an extended period of time. So I really needed the space to just be in a place where I could really come to understand the purposes my eating disorder served and also all that it took away from me. And that's the great irony, of course, of eating disorders is that you think they're going to make you feel closer to someone or that they're going to give you control, and yet they end up taking all of that and more away. And so in residential treatment, I was able to recognize that and really able to finally start grieving the death of my mother. And it wasn't until I was in residential that I started to experience these intense feelings of sadness and anger, and being able to express those emotions and find other outlets for coping with those was incredibly helpful in residential treatment.
I was thinking of a few things as you were talking, that with the social contagion that we can consider or sort of see, or maybe even used to be more of a conversation around, should we treat people with eating disorders together? Is that a good idea? Won't they learn things from each other? I've been in this field for a long time, and I remember earlier in my career, people saying that, like, is this a good idea? Maybe we shouldn't have these people together. And I thought, wow, I think we would put people with, I don't know, diabetes together in a support group, and they could help each other learn things. Or we put people who experience lung cancer together in a support group, and we put their families together in support groups to really learn from each other. But I think if we fast forward into the, certainly, today's day and age, but over the last, probably 10 years, which is sort of post when you were in treatment, social media is such an incredibly powerful force now that it's hard to imagine people learn a lot, quote unquote, in treatment from each other that they wouldn't have been able to access very easily, unfortunately, very easily on social media, because social media is so full of sort of pro eating disorder and also, diet culture fueled dieting and weight loss tips, that it strikes me that the field is sort of evolved in many ways, partially because our thinking evolved and partially because society evolved to have different ways for people to learn things. Have you reflected on that at all as you think about, what it's like now versus what the sort of exposures were for you when you were in treatment?
Yes, very much so, because certainly social media was not around when I was struggling and when I was in treatment. And so that social contagion that is so prevalent online now was not something I was exposed to. And so it felt much more dramatic being in a hospital setting where I was absorbing these ideas and these tips, so to speak. And so I think nowadays there's so many more avenues, unfortunately, for accessing that type of content. And I think now too, treatment centers seem to be a lot better about having group therapy and sort of managing some of the conversations that eating disorder patients have. Whereas when I was in treatment, there really weren't inpatient group therapy sessions. And so, left to our own devices, we sometimes would have toxic conversations rather than productive ones, even though we were all supportive of each other too. But we were so just wrapped up in our eating disorders that it was hard to really step outside of that. So I think that just as I look at the evolution of care over time, well, I think I got the best care possible in the late 90s, early 2000s. I think that the field has advanced so much and that we know so much more about eating disorders now. So I think that there's a lot that we can celebrate in that regard.
Absolutely. I even think about the degree to which there are eating disorder residential facilities that are specifically designed for people with eating disorders, understanding that I believe the facility that you received care in had more of a mixed group of people there versus a sort of specialty designed eating disorder residential program. And even that's changed. Now people have programs that are designed based on what we know about eating disorders, the neurobiology of eating disorders, the social aspects, the support, all of the things we've learned with research. So I'd like to think we're making some progress as we go over time.
Yes, definitely. I think so too. That was a big just part of the book in terms of asking that question, how has care evolved and changed? So it's fascinating to learn how it's evolved over the years.
Absolutely, that is a fascinating part of the book, how you sort of explain, here's what it was for me, and here's how things have evolved, and here's why. It's one of the things I love about the book, that you really give the why and the research behind it, and the sort of research programs that have lent understanding to the process over time, not just single studies. So you do a really beautiful job of weaving all of those pieces together to help us understand even more about what's happening, and also I think highlight sort of shine some lights on what more we may learn to keep us open to the idea that there's more to know than what we know right now. How about if you go a little further down the path? You were in residential treatment for that 17 months. Then you went home. How did your recovery evolve as you transitioned back into home? I know you have some you conceptualize them as pillars of recovery. Can you tell us a little bit about those pillars and then sort of how your recovery journey evolved once you were back at home after residential treatment?
Yes. So I do have some pillars of recovery, and these are essentially just some of the key tenets of my own recovery process and things I found helpful. And so one of them was understanding the origins of my eating disorder, because I think a lot of times we tend to simplify narratives over time. And for a long time, I said, well, my mother's death caused my eating disorder. But as I began to go back in time, I recognized that it wasn't just her death, but it was a suppressed grief, and it was this idea of needing to be strong and of kind of consuming all this media and the health class. And there were just all these different aspects. And I think being able to unpack each of those was really important and helpful. And being able to hold space for each of those things was really critical. And I think also the second pillar is learning to expand my identity beyond the eating disorder. So recognizing that I was so much more than my disorder. And in many ways, I felt like the eating disorder had taken up almost all of my identity, to the point where I really wasn't engaging in things that I loved, and I was not talking with friends, and I had really distanced myself. But in recovery, I was able to regain a sense of self and see myself as Mallary, right? As this thriving teenager who wanted to be a writer someday and who wanted to go off and accomplish great things. And I began to feel really energized about reconnecting with myself and who I was outside of my disorder. The third pillar was letting myself grieve and feel emotions. And so I think that this can be true of anyone in recovery, just recognizing that we need to be able to experience emotions and feel them and not numb them with the eating disorder. So that was important for me. The fourth was learning to see the eating disorder as the problem and not the solution, which I think can be really tricky, because so often we turn to our eating disorder when we need to cope with something. And sometimes it's the first go to. But being able to recognize those moments where I was either turning to the eating disorder or felt tempted to do so, and then trying to redirect myself, was a really important step in my recovery. And then lastly, giving myself grace when I slip. And this was one that didn't kind of come to me initially once I left treatment, but over time I came to see it as a pillar of my recovery. And it took me some time to get to this fifth pillar, because when I left residential treatment, I really wanted to embrace full recovery. And I will say, I didn't exactly know what that meant. In my mind, I envisioned it as this perfectionistic ideal and thought that it meant that I would never have a bad body image day, that I would eat everything I was supposed to without any inhibitions or reservations. I would get all the A's, be involved in all the extracurriculars. And I was always a perfectionist, and I really wanted to be the poster child for eating disorder recovery. And so for 2 years after I left residential treatment, I was embodying what I thought was sort of full recovery and was doing all of those things that I mentioned. But when I got to college, for a variety of reasons, I found myself suddenly caught in this very vicious cycle of binging and restricting, and felt like I was failing at both my recovery and also my anorexia. And at the time, I didn't know anything about diagnostic crossover and didn't know that different diagnoses can kind of cross over and you can develop symptoms from other eating disorders. And I didn't realize that many people with anorexia also can struggle with binge eating. And so I felt very ashamed and also very confused as to what was happening. And I thought that I needed to remain silent about it because I was too afraid to ask for help. And I thought, I'm supposed to be fully recovered, so I cannot be engaging in these behaviors. There's something wrong with me, right? So For well over 10 years, I struggled with this vicious cycle and didn't tell anyone. And I realize now that eating disorders thrive in silence and secrecy. And I think it's the silence and secrecy that can really keep us sick and stuck. And so I needed to be able to kind of re envision what recovery looked like for me with the mindset that recovery is possible, but it is not always perfect. And for me, full recovery just seemed elusive, and I needed to be able to redefine it for myself. And so at the time, I was working for a nonprofit and I was helping journalists to tell what we called restorative narratives, which essentially are these narratives that show how people in communities make meaningful pathways forward in the aftermath of trauma or illness. And as I was helping journalists to tell these stories, it occurred to me that this could be a really helpful framework for my own recovery. And so I began to think about this sort of gray space and what does it mean to make progress, knowing that you may still slip. And I came to call it the middle place. And so for me, once I began to develop that framework and that thinking, it really enabled me to make progress. And I was able to get out of this binge restrict cycle. I also had met my husband around the same time, so there were other life factors that came into play. But being able to give myself grace and to recognize that my recovery is not perfect and it's something that I still have to work hard at every day was really refreshing and helpful for me as I thought about just what could be most effective for me and my own progress in recovery.
Yeah, it strikes me as interesting that the sort of meeting of your husband about that same time, because it sort of leads into what I was thinking in terms of community of support. So we know that a community of support can be really key to supporting recovery from an eating disorder, and maybe it's key to really navigating that sort of middle place in recovery. What kind of supports do you know have been helpful to you, and or do you think about when you think about sort of helping people navigate this middle place in recovery?
Yeah, so I think it's critical to have support. And I was very lucky in that I had a father who really cared for me, and my paternal grandmother stepped in and helped as well. I remember being in residential treatment with many, many girls who did not have a family to return to. And so I recognized how lucky I was. And it took a little while for my father and grandmother to really provide the support that I needed, partly because eating disorders can be so enigmatic. And I remember my father would say, "You're so smart. Why can't you just figure this out? Or just step on a scale and see that you're losing weight?" Or I remember my grandmother visited me in the hospital and I had a tray just full of food. And she said, "Wow, that is a lot of food." And it was not what I needed to hear at the moment, but but from feedback from my clinicians and other people who were supporting me at the time, they were able to learn what to say and what not to say, and what was going to be most helpful in terms of supporting me. So I really appreciate that they were willing to really learn and try to understand the disorder more. And that was really just partly because I had treatment providers at Boston Children's Hospital and in residential treatment who were able to also be a support system for me, but my family as well, because we often had family therapy sessions. And I think looking back, when I was struggling with binging and restricting in college and beyond, I didn't seek support. And I thought that I was better than that, or I should be better and I shouldn't need help. And I think that was really detrimental that I didn't ask for help and that I didn't think that I could. And so when I met my husband, I was initially worried about telling him about my eating disorder story. And I thought, well, is this going to make him turn away from me? Is he going to just run away? But I told him, and it seemed that in being vulnerable, it actually enabled us to be closer to each other because we could really see each other and understand each other's flaws. And he could just come to really know me as a person, know my story, understand where I was compared to how much I had grown, but also he could recognize that it was still something I needed support with. And he then could help to provide that support. And similarly, he had to learn about eating disorders and how do you help somebody who's in sort of ongoing recovery. So I've had a lot of support along the way. And when I started writing this book, I did make a very conscious decision to go back to therapy because I felt like that was going to be really important as a writer. I've often said that writing can be therapeutic, but it's not therapy. And so I think you can write in a journal and work things out on the page that way, but I didn't want to be working out things in the actual book. And I also knew that in order to write this book, I would have to re inhabit my younger self in some ways by looking at my old journal entries from treatment, looking at my old medical records, revisiting the places where I was treated. And I knew that that would conjure up a lot of emotions. So I did go back to therapy, and I still see a therapist and dietitian just as maintenance. And I think that that's been really important for me to recognize that there's nothing to be ashamed of in continuing to see folks in an outpatient capacity. And I think that doing so has really enabled me to stay on track and to just make sure that I'm always actively working on recovery.
Yeah, it's a beautiful illustration of the different ways support can be so important to us. I always think when somebody I'm working with says some version of like, no, I want to do this myself, that sort of sense that we as people who struggle with eating disorders should be able to do it all by ourselves, or we don't want other people to know because it's embarrassing or shameful, or we're feeling like we should have it all figured out. And I over time have developed a response to that statement of like, I'm so glad you want to do this by yourself because it's a lot of work. It's an enormous amount of work. And it's also okay to have other people help you. You get to do the bulk of the work. The person who's struggling does the bulk of the work, and other people can help. It's okay to need other people to support your own expertise and contribute their expertise. Together, you can really get a little further down the path. But that it's sort of in some way sort of harnesses that desire that I've seen so frequently of people who are like, no, I really want to be able to do this. Like, great, you have to really, you really have to do a lot of work, and it's okay to ask for support along the way. In fact, that's strength to ask for support. How about let's talk a little bit more about the middle place, because I think I have a couple questions here. One is sort of what recommendations do you have for clinicians that might be working with people in that middle place? And the other one is, see if I can put this to words. Often people when they hear that I work in eating disorders will say something like, oh, my relative, struggles with an eating disorder, and they always come to whatever holiday and it seems obvious that something's wrong or going on with their eating, but that's just the way they are. That's just sort of where they are, and it's probably never going to get better, right? That's what they'll say to me. And I think maybe that's not quite the same middle place you're talking about. I think that's sort of the like because my desire in those situations is always to say, would probably be great if you could encourage your loved one to get some professional support in that, because that doesn't quite sound like the end of their path. I think maybe there's more there for them to do. So tell us a little bit more about how you're sort of conceptualizing this middle place and how it might be able to be supported by clinicians working with folks there. And then lastly, sort of how that's different than being sort of maybe stuck more in a not having had enough support kind of way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that because I think that there may be misconceptions around this idea of the middle place. And so I think it's really important to explain what it means, what it looks like. And for me, it's about active recovery, right? It's about moving forward in recovery with the notion that recovery is possible. So that's really at the basis of this idea of the middle place. And it's not about settling for stagnancy. It's about trying to move forward, knowing that along the way you might slip. And part of the importance of this middle place framing is recognizing that slips can be part of the process. It doesn't mean you're going to slip necessarily for the rest of your life, but being able to give yourself grace when you slip and recognize the slips so that they don't turn into uncontrollable slides and lead to relapse or lead to a place of stagnancy. Because I think what you were talking about earlier is more so when you're stagnant, you're not really working toward recovery. You may not even know that it's possible. You're not really seeking or getting help. And we need to help folks in that space too. But that's, if we think about this as a spectrum, is more so on the sicker side of the spectrum, whereas the middle place is this space in between sickness and full recovery. But it's about always trying to move forward. And I think about this word slip because I remember I was talking to a clinician and I told her the title of the book, and she said, "Well, I wouldn't title it slip because that has a really negative connotation in our field." And I said, "Well, that's precisely the point, right?" Because I want to destigmatize slips because for so long I thought that I couldn't slip. And I was afraid early on in my recovery that if I made one wrong move and if I slipped just once, I would fall back into dangerous territory. I did not think there was any sort of space in between. And so for me, it would have been so helpful for someone to say that there was this middle place and that slips can happen. And even if you think about that very word slip, in some ways it suggests forward movement because you can't slip if you're standing still. And so I think we need to look at it that way. And so the middle place is really about not expecting perfection, but recognizing that recovery can be messy, it can be difficult, it is imperfect, and it's not going to just sort of, help you arrive necessarily at a finish line. I think for a long time I thought about recovery as sort of this series of straight arrows that were pointing toward a finish line. And I thought, as long as I get to that finish line, I will be fully recovered. And again, I didn't exactly know what did that mean, right? And I think even the field has many different definitions of what full recovery means. And now I think about recovery as more so a series of circles almost. And the size of those circles can shrink or expand over time depending on life's ebbs and flows, but they're always moving in a forward direction. But there may be life moments where maybe we slip and the size of that circle shrinks a little bit, but other times where we feel like we are doing really well and we're really well supported and the size of that circle expands. In many ways, it's like that with grief and loss, right? I mean, I don't think that I will ever feel closure when it comes to my mother's death, but I feel like the load of that loss has lightened over time. And sometimes it's harder than others when I experience something and I think, I really wish my mom were here with me. Like, yeah, that just feels really hard, right? And it's similar to moments where we might be tempted to fall back into the eating disorder when things are really hard. But there are other times when it's a little bit easier and I don't think about my mom or missing her as much, or it's not as painful. And so I think there's a lot of parallels there as we think about recovery from an eating disorder and recovery from lots of other things, right? Grief, loss, even anxiety or depression. So I think it's important for clinicians to just recognize this space and to talk about it more and to give voice to folks in the middle place, because for so long I read a lot of books that were incredibly helpful to me, but these eating disorder books were typically written either by clinicians or by people who were fully recovered. And I didn't see my own kind of lived experience reflected in those books. And that lack of a mirrored image left me feeling misunderstood. So I think the more we can give voice to people in the middle place, the better. And I think too, for clinicians, this will help to kind of think about more inclusive approaches to defining and describing eating disorder recovery, because I think that when we only have these two extremes of kind of either you're sick or you're fully recovered, it makes it really hard to know, how do we fit into that? What if we're not fully recovered? Then are we sick, right? So I think it helps us to welcome healing in all of its different forms. And I think too that one other thing I just want to add is that sometimes when I've talked about the middle place, I have feared that people might think that I am talking about quasi or pseudo recovery. And I actually think that those can be harmful terms because I think of them more so along the lines of people like myself who years ago would say, I'm fully recovered, and yet I was still very much struggling. For me, that was kind of quasi recovery, right? The middle place is not about that. And I think those terms, quasi and pseudo recovery, can be harmful because they can suggest that someone's struggles are fake or not real. And so this is not about that. This is really about encouraging recovery, but also embracing the nuance that comes with that and helping people to expand the ways in which they talk about recovery.
I love that. It really reflects sort of the process, that the very much nonlinear process that recovery can be for many, many people. In fact, for most people, but it really is. It would be great if we could predict exactly how it will go. And we really can't do that very well. And I also think I was thinking about slip as the title, and I actually really totally hear what that person was was sort of saying about the field. But I love the title because two things. One, when you said, it reflects forward motion, right? We slip if it's a sort of physical slip on something. We slip when we're moving, and sometimes when you slip, you grab yourself and you're okay, and you keep going, and you think, oh, that was a little tricky, but I got it, and I kept going. And sometimes you fall and you can get up on your own, and sometimes you fall and you need help to get up, and sometimes you need a lot of help to get up, and sometimes you just need a little bit of help to get up. So as I read the book, I kept thinking, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because that's kind of how eating disorder recovery goes. Sometimes you have a little eating disorder slip, and you can get yourself back on track and move ahead and learn a little bit from it. And sometimes you really need somebody to come in and help you get up off the sort of, eating disorder floor, if you will. So I like it. What are your hopes for people reading the book? You spoke a little bit about this just now, but what are your hopes of maybe somebody struggling with an eating disorder, or a loved one of somebody struggling with an eating disorder? I know that we read a lot of books about eating disorder stories, and sometimes they're really helpful for people who are going through it. And sometimes those books aren't maybe as helpful for those folks, but are really helpful for loved ones. How are you thinking about this book in terms of hopes for people reading it?
Yeah, so I think the primary audience of this book is people who have lived experience with an eating disorder, and especially people who find themselves in this middle place. Because for so many of the people I interviewed, they said that they were in this space, but they never had a name for it, and they never really talked about it. And so that to me signaled that there needs to be more of a conversation around what this middle place looks like. So I do hope that people will read this and feel seen and heard and feel empowered to share their own narratives about the ongoingness of recovery. I also think that although I talk about the middle place as being this space in between acute sickness and full recovery, I think it's also an apt term for the space that some people find themselves in when they've experienced some sort of trigger and then are beginning to engage in behaviors that could lead to an eating disorder. And so there is this middle place where we need to have more preventive measures and awareness. And I think people can very quickly descend into an eating disorder if they don't receive help in that space. And so I hope the book will reach some folks who may be wondering, am I engaging in harmful behaviors, or could this lead to an eating disorder, or do I have an eating disorder? So I hope it reaches those folks. And the other two audiences that I think a lot about are caretakers and medical providers. So, certainly, this is the type of book I wish that my father and grandfather would have had when I was in treatment. And I think that it will be really helpful for caretakers to understand how to better support their loved ones, but also to help them understand just more about eating disorders. I think it's very easy to kind of think that eating disorders are a choice, but they are not. And there are so many neurobiological factors at play. There can be genetic factors at play. And I didn't know anything about those things when I was in treatment because the research really wasn't happening. And there's been some fascinating research that has come out about just how these disorders can affect the brain and how genetics play into them. And so I think that for me it was fascinating to learn about that. And I suspect that those with lived experience and caretakers will learn a lot from that research that is included in the book. And lastly, the medical providers. I think back to when I was just seeing the pediatrician and he did not realize that I had an eating disorder. And I think that there's certainly folks who are trained like you and others who understand eating disorders and can really provide help for folks who are struggling. But we know from research that most medical doctors do not receive training on eating disorders. The average is 0 to 2 hours of training in med school and residency. And that's really problematic when you consider how many people are struggling with eating disorders in our country and abroad. And so I think that if we can get this book into the hands of more medical providers, hopefully it will help them to better understand eating disorders and to dispel some misconceptions. Because I talked with so many folks who said that they did not get the treatment that they needed. And in some cases, it took years for them to get treatment because they lived in a larger body and their medical providers didn't realize that they were struggling with anorexia and didn't know anything about atypical anorexia, or folks who were transgendered and they just came up against barriers to treatment because people thought, well, you don't look the part of someone with an eating disorder. So I think there's so many inherent barriers to care. And my hope is that the more people understand eating disorders, the more we can get to a point where everyone who needs care will have equal access to it.
I love that vision. I join you in wanting that. Okay, so we ask everyone this last question. What would you say to somebody listening who thinks recovery, even being in something that they might conceptualize as this middle place? What would you say if they think it's just not possible for me?
Yeah, so I've definitely talked with folks who feel this way, and it breaks my heart a little bit. And at the same time, I can empathize with them because for a long time, I felt that way too. And so I think part of it is really trying to seek support and recognizing that eating disorders do thrive in secrecy. And the more we can talk with someone, even if it's just a trusted friend to begin with, it doesn't necessarily have to be a clinician right away. You hope you can work toward that, but just asking for help, talking with someone is so important. And if you don't get help the first time you ask, try until you find somebody who can give you that help. Because I talked with many folks who said, I just didn't get the help I needed. Every time I asked for help, I wouldn't get it. And they had to keep asking, unfortunately, but eventually could get the help that they needed, partly because they were intent on continuing to ask for that help. And I wish that weren't the case. I wish we could just ask for help and get it, but that doesn't always happen. And so I think sometimes that persistence is necessary in order for us to get to a better place. I also think too that it's really important to celebrate small victories and to try to aim for what I like to call more recovery. So sometimes the idea of trying to attain full recovery or any semblance of recovery can feel a bit daunting and insurmountable. And for me, I like to think a lot about more recovery. So maybe that's 0.5% one day. Maybe it's 10% another day, right? Maybe you make the choice to eat just a regular slice of bread as opposed to a thin slice of bread, right? And that is a step toward more recovery, right? It doesn't mean that you're not going to have other bad choices that day or other things that may interfere with your recovery, but being able to recognize those very, very tiny steps and celebrate those small victories, I think can help and can accumulate over time. And so I think we just need to kind of sometimes shift our mindset so that we're not just thinking that we either have to reach full recovery or we've totally failed. There's something in between that we can also be striving for.
Absolutely. And I love how the concepts of persistence and accomplishing a little more recovery really dovetail with what you so eloquently described in the book and what we know about the genetics of eating disorders, that people with eating disorders are more genetically likely to be really persistent, sort of have that persistence trait, and also be perhaps a little competitive or achieving, compelled to achieve. And so what a great way to harness those traits that the eating disorder can absolutely try to take advantage of, but harnessing those traits towards recovery to really persist and to drive for more recovery. I love it. I love it. Mallary, where can people find your book and when does it come out?
Yeah, so it comes out on August 5th, but it is available for pre-order. So if you're planning to buy it, might as well pre-order, and you can do so on Amazon or Barnes and Noble or your local bookstore's websites.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Thank you for sharing your story, sharing your book, and for sharing your passion. We so appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. If you enjoyed today's episode of Piecemeal, please subscribe, rate, or leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Learn more about us at emilyprogram.com or find the Emily Program on social media. Piecemeal is produced by the amazing podcast team at the Emily Program. Until next time, take care. Thanks for listening.